Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Uzma Jalaluddin in conversation with Bianca Osbourne. On the right hand of your screen is a chat box. Please use this to submit your questions and comments to our speakers. Today we are here to celebrate International Women's Day in a celebration of women's fiction. International Women's Day is a global celebration of the achievement of women, and Hamilton Public Library is tremendously pleased to host Uzma on this day in particular, for her stories about contemporary love and life are retellings of iconic women's stories. Ayesha At Last from 2018 is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and the book we are discussing today, Hana Khan Carries On, is inspired by You've Got Mail, directed by Nora Ephron. It is described by Uzma Jalaluddin Khan as, quote, a novel of wit, heart, substance, and depth, a love story that explores the challenging issues of our times, unquote. We encourage you to find Uzma's publications at local independent bookstores like Epic Books at their Lock and Sherman Avenue locations, King West Books in Westdale, The City in the City on Ottawa Street, and all retailers that support books and literacy. I will take a moment to acknowledge that the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional terraces of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. Now let's meet our speakers. Uzma Jalaluddin grew up in a diverse suburb of Toronto, but her favorite place in the world is the nearest bookstore or library. Her debut novel, Ayesha At Last, 2018, was a Goodreads Choice Award finalist, featured on the Today Show, and was a Cosmopolitan UK Book of the Year and Publishers Weekly Best Book of 2019. Ayesha At Last was optioned for film by Pascal Pictures. Hana Khan Carries On, 2021, was an instant Canadian bestseller and has been optioned for film by Amazon Studios and Mindy Kaling. Uzma also writes a culture and parenting column for the Toronto Star and has written for The Atlantic. She lives near Toronto, Canada with her husband and 2 sons, where she also teaches high school. Bianca Osbourne is a TV personality, host, and media trainer based in Toronto, Ontario. As a food expert on Canada's #1 daytime talk show, The Marilyn Dennis Show, host of her own nationally syndicated cooking show, and the voice of the popular On My Plate podcast, Bianca's passion is connecting with people through food and conversation. Thank you, Uzma and Bianca. I'll pass things over to Bianca now.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm so excited for this conversation because I just read the book. I like to read a book like right before I talk about it. And it was one of those books that I was like, I'm so glad I get to talk to you because I want to say thank you for writing this book. It was such a good read and like unexpected in so many different ways. So the first thing that I just want to ask you is that often when we see books that are written about like coming of age, it doesn't really touch on like 24 years old. But Hana in this book is 24. And I think that's the age where adulthood and childhood starts to shift. You start to look at the lens of life through the like eyes of an adult as opposed to a child. So why did you want Hana to be 24 as opposed to some other age?
When I was first of all, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And Bianca, I'm so happy to be talking to you.
And I think happy to talk to you.
It's so great that you're into cooking because this book is so much about food, and I'm sure we're going to dive into that really soon. So Hana Khan is 24 years old. And my first novel, Ayesha At Last, the main character was 27, so she's a little bit closer to her late 20s. But I knew when I was writing this book that I really wanted to capture that age where, like you said, a character really is kind of like crossing the threshold between sort of being like a young adult and really entering actual adulthood. She's faced with, I wanted to write about a young Muslim woman who was sort of facing these really major decisions. She's on the threshold of, okay, I'm done school. The formal part of my education is done. I've amassed these couple of degrees. Now what? Because the uniformity of school life is now done, and she reflects at a couple points in the book that, you know, even her close friends, they don't see each other anymore because they don't go to school in the same way. And I think that time in your life is so key. Like the early 20s are just so, I remember feeling when I was 21, 22 years old, just like, what am I doing with my life? I have no idea. And yet I've been following this trajectory where I feel like I should have known. Looking back now, it's like, oh, the 20s are just a baby. But I really wanted to capture that. And I also think that Hana, as a South Asian, young South Asian Muslim woman, we don't get to see these characters of color really at the cusp of something, being able to be like messy and kind of bratty and just all over the place and really exploring who they are and who they want to be.
Amazing. And I wanted to use that as a question, as an opportunity to sort of like give everyone sort of an introduction to Hana before you do your reading. So I wanted to introduce that. So please, Uzma, read for us.
So I'll be reading from, in anticipation of, in celebration of International Women's Day, I'll be reading from a part of the book where Hana is really putting out there what she wants in terms of her ambition. She's, like you said, she's 24 years old. She studied broadcasting in school. What she really wants is to work in radio. And so when we find her in the story, she is basically interning at a radio station while also helping out at her mother's Indian restaurant in Scarborough. And this is when her frenemy at work, Thomas, a fellow intern, basically tries to sabotage her and kind of says, okay, we're going to do this idea for a show, and she is not pleased at all. So that's just a little bit of context. So this is from page 61. Working on a show, any show, was all I had ever wanted to do. So far, all Thomas and I had done in our internship was file, photocopy, archive, and research other people's stories. The first time I had done a job that excited me had been the day before, when Marissa let me co-produce Big J's show. Hosting a show about culture and religion was not what I wanted to do. The worst part was, Thomas knew how I felt. We had talked about it before. Who is going to tell the stories only we know? We're South Asian, we're second-generation immigrants, you're Indian Muslim, and I'm Indian Christian, both minorities within minority communities. We have things to say and diverse perspectives that people would love to hear, he had argued. Is that your tagline? I'm brown, I'm interesting, listen to me? The minute I start writing stories about the Muslim or brown community, I'll be put in a box, and that will be all I'll ever do or ever be known for. I'm too young and interesting to be the exotic brown person expert for the next 30 years, I had argued back. Hana, you could be the person who changes people's minds about Muslims, Thomas would counter. That comment always made me laugh. The bigots are never going to listen to me, and everyone else already likes me because as an Indian Canadian, I stand for samosas and maple syrup. I'm good. The truth was, Thomas had less to lose. When a man talks about politics and religion next to a brown-skinned woman who wears hijab, guess who attracts the misogynist trolls and violent death threats? I come by my cowardice honestly, through the experiences of those braver than myself. I had no desire to be a social justice martyr. I wanted to follow my instincts and my own interests, not use my faith and skin color to provide teachable moments to listeners on demand. Thomas knew how I felt, yet he had pitched his stupid idea anyway. He really was the worst.
He was the worst.
He was the worst.
Until he wasn't. You know what I mean?
He redeemed himself.
Yeah, exactly. He was the worst until he wasn't. And so, I mean, speaking of Hana's experience in her job, like Marissa, the character of Marissa, I feel like we all have maybe encountered a Marissa in our life. I very much disliked Marissa, but I wanted to know, is Marissa written from your own experience, like there was a Marissa, or is she just like the conjuring of all the Marissas you've heard about in life?
I mean, she's an amalgam of different experiences, different people. That I don't have a Marissa per se, but I have that person or those people in my life who, over the course of my experiences, just growing up in Canada, growing up in Toronto, as a teacher, as, like a parent in the world, as a woman in the world, who have, basically, I've experienced microaggressions. I've experienced covert and overt acts of racism and ignorance. And I think that it's really hard to be like a BIPOC person in the world. I'm a visible Muslim woman who wears hijab, and not to have experienced that would be extremely rare, I think. So what I was really trying to do in this book, my first novel, Ayesha At Last, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling. The racism and Islamophobia that one of the characters faces in that book is like really obvious. It's really like in your face, you can almost like call it out on the page. This is racism. This is hate. But what I really wanted to do in this book is show the worst qualities of the kind of poisonous drip of toxic, ignorant questions that can erode a young person's self-esteem and belief in themselves until they feel like they're being gaslit and they don't even realize what is happening to them until their sense of self has been completely taken away from them. And then juxtapose that with the really obvious Islamophobic attack that happens on her street that I'm sure we'll get to, and just be like, look, these are two different types of hate and hate-motivated attacks. This is two different types of racism, but it is they're both equally damaging in a way.
Now, speaking on what happened, the downtown incident of Islamophobia, some people would argue that you should leave it out of a book that's meant to be lighthearted and kind of like, don't put it in, leave it somewhere else. Why did you decide to put it in the book as opposed to just letting it just be this lighthearted read?
Well, you know what? When I sat down to write this book, first of all, I go where the story takes me. So in a way, as much as the incident you're referring to is when Hana Khan is downtown with her cousin and with the love interest, and they basically get verbally assaulted. They get verbally attacked, and there's a bit of a physical, scuffle between these two white supremacists who attack them, and they target them because Hana wears hijab and they're brown skinned, obviously clearly Muslim people, and it happens in the middle of the book. So the first part of the book is like, okay, this is rom-com, meet cute, etc., etc. And then right in the middle of the book, you have this very jarring moment. There's no foreshadowing. It just kind of happens out of nowhere. And the reason why I included it, a couple of reasons. Number one was because that's how hate attacks happen. You're walking along your day, you're living your best life. Maybe you're not really aware of your surroundings for the first time and you let your guard down and then something out of the blue happens. And I wanted the reader to feel that same sense of disorientation and confusion and immediate defensiveness that someone who's experienced that, and I myself have experienced, not at the same level, but I've definitely been yelled at while I'm walking down the street, and I've definitely had people say horrible things to me. I wanted them to experience that because I think reading ultimately is such an act of trying to develop empathy and compassion for other experiences. And unfortunately, this is the lived experience of a lot of Muslims, a lot of South Asians, a lot of people of color who live in our city. I needed this to be, very obviously happening kind of in the shadow of the CN Tower. Like, we don't live in a city where this kind of stuff doesn't happen. In fact, it happens all the time. And I think that you can write it, like, I wanted to write a story that was still funny and lighthearted and just like a joy to read, but also acknowledge that the flip side of truth is also pain and sadness. And this is an experience that, as much as you can laugh at the jokes and, enjoy the Sweeney love story of Hana Khan Carries On, also you need to kind of be there for her pain as well.
And I love how you said that it happens in the middle of the book, because I went through a whole range of emotions. And I think it really is, you feel the shift in Hana going from child to adult, because things get really heavy from that point onward. And, the funeral chapter had me in tears. I was like, well, I'm reading and crying. Like, I can barely see what I'm talking about. And so did you intentionally write this book with all of those emotional ranges and like that journey in mind? Or was that just kind of the byproduct of the story that you wanted to tell?
I definitely write my book in phases. So like the first phase is sort of like the outline. Okay, I think these are the sort of beats that I want to hit. And you know, the first draft is just the bare bones of the story, and then I just keep building on all of those emotions. But I knew that one of my goals as a writer is, you know, obviously to tell a story that's fun. I love romantic comedies, so tell a story that's entertaining. I want people, you know, flipping pages because they can't stop reading because they want to know what happens next. Like that's such a goal as a writer. But my other goal as a writer is to really try to introduce some of my readers perhaps to a community that they maybe never interacted with. Like I know going into this that there are readers who maybe have never talked to a Muslim person before, who've never like experienced anything about, you know, how does a Muslim go about their day? How do they pray? What happens when someone in the community dies? Like what are the traditions that happen in the Muslim community? And so I wanted to show what those traditions were, and part of that is, you know, not just going for Friday prayers, but the janazah, the funeral rites for a Muslim, which, like for me growing up, I know that I've attended lots of funerals, unfortunately, and I wanted to share that with the readers. And I think when you're writing comedy, you always also have to take into account the flip side of that. Like I said before, the sadness. How do we grieve together? How do we come together as a community and move on from really hard things and support each other when we need it?
I love that. And I found that, you know, like you said, this was like a Sunni love story, and it was a unique like telling of it, because there are a lot of people, like you said, that have never met a Muslim person, and they don't know, you know, how Muslim people date, what it looks like in your culture. And so both Aiden and Hana are Muslim. And so what considerations did you make to ensure that the story was told from the perspective of, you know, Muslim Sunni love story, but also that would hook readers like me who aren't a part of the community?
Yeah, that's a tightrope, right? Like that's the balance. I'm writing a story that I know is set in what some people would consider a very niche community, and yet I'm tackling sort of universal themes, right? So for both Hana and Aiden, it's the conceit of, you know, the log line for the story is, I'm writing You've Got Mail set in rival halal restaurants. So if people are familiar with the famous movie with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, it's that movie, but it's rival halal restaurants. So that immediately brings in the pop cultural references of this really famous movie, but then situates it in this niche community. It's like, it's not just restaurants, it's rival halal restaurants. So you know that the characters are Muslim. And so as a writer, I'm really aware of who my audience is. And to be honest, I'm my audience. So when I write my story, I don't want to necessarily over-explain things. Like if there's like a word that, like for instance, I just use the word janaza, which is a Muslim funeral. That's the word for it. But I don't want to, you know, I know that a lot of my readers might be Muslim or might be familiar with the customs, and a lot of my readers won't be. But I think over-explaining every single term kind of bogs down the narrative. So there's ways to do this, and I feel like I'm always growing and learning as a writer myself. So I'll explain a little bit, but I won't get into details. I'm hoping that, you know, readers are sophisticated. They'll be able to pick up through contextual clues what's actually happening in the story, or I'll use an explanatory comma if I need to. But ultimately, like I grew up, this is a silly example, but I've never celebrated Christmas before in my life, and yet if someone shows me a picture of a Christmas tree, like I know what a Christmas tree is. I've never had one set up in my house. None of my family celebrates Christmas, and yet as someone who grew up in Canada, like I get the whole concept of a Christmas tree. And if I see it in a movie, I get through the contextual clues, and as well as my own experience, what that means. So I want readers to feel comfortable doing that for books that are maybe set outside of their own experience. And I think it's great that with greater diversity in publishing is trying at least to welcome new voices. They can do a lot more, but the doors are kind of open a little bit. This is the fun part of reading stories that are set outside of your experience. Like I've done it all my life. You guys can do it too, you know?
Oh my gosh, I love that. And then just still on that note, would you like ever write a book where it was like mixed cultural love story, marriage kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I go where the story takes me. I have no, I have no particular. Sorry, my My phone just went and then you disappeared. I have no, like right now, I think it's so important for me as someone who has like a really, I think I have a unique perspective, both on my experiences having lived within a very close-knit Muslim community. I'm still part of a close-knit Toronto East End, Scarborough Muslim community, and also having grown up in Canada. And I don't think there's a lot of writers. In fact, I know there aren't a lot of writers who have that same experience, who can identify as, being part of the intersection of so many different identities. It's like second generation Canadian, the daughter of immigrants. And so I feel for me like almost it shouldn't be this way, but like a responsibility to write that representative story, that who else is going to do it? Like, in fact, other people have been doing it and they've been doing a really bad job. That is, because the representation hasn't been as authentic. It hasn't included those kind of really authentic details that only someone like me perhaps would be able to get. That being said, I think it's important that writers write whatever story interests them. I don't believe in censorship. I think that as long as if I were going to write my example from before about Christmas, I would have to make sure that I did my homework. Because I've never celebrated it. So I would hope that someone who would write about my community would also do their homework. And as a writer, always approach things with compassion and empathy and respect. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you absolutely did. And that, speaking of, someone who isn't of your perspective telling your story, it relates back to Thomas. I mean, Hannah said, you don't want to do this radicalization episode. Like, you don't want to do it. I'm telling you from my experience, you don't want to do it. The guy goes and does it. And then what happens? Exactly what she said would happen.
Exactly.
And so I think that just brings up, it sort of circles back to that point of stepping into that role of okay, I have to be the one to tell these stories, or else someone's going to tell it maybe in a way that doesn't serve us.
Yeah. Yeah. And the example of Thomas is really interesting. So I name him, his name is Thomas Matthews, but he is also the child of immigrants from India. So his parents are Christian Indians. So they're from the southern part of India. My husband is also, his family is from the southern part of India. And so there's a lot of Christians who live in Kerala or Madras or Goa, for instance. These are different provinces in India. And so what I was trying to show in that experience is these are two kids who are actually racialized. They're both racialized, but they both have two different faiths. And so the privileges of Thomas as a man, as someone who is, maybe he's brown, he's not white, but he definitely has the same faith as the majority of the population in Canada. That affords him a certain perspective. And so he doesn't really get, in some ways, where Hannah is coming from, because she's a woman and she always has to think about, every time she opens her mouth or she shares something about her experiences, people will automatically judge her because of her femaleness, because of her, because of her Muslim experience. And it's this is the thing, even within marginalized communities, there's so much diversity, and not everyone's on the same page or even has had the same experiences. So that was one of the subtleties that I wanted to include in my book.
I love that. And I feel like that was really highlighted. And so as a first generation Canadian reading this book, I definitely saw myself in Hannah. And the story is about Hannah. I mean, it's called Hana Khan Carries On, but there is quite a supporting cast. And I think that speaks to, when people come to, from different countries and they come as immigrants, how the supporting cast really means a lot. And so how did you decide on who was going to be the family to Hannah? Why did she have a sister? Why, her dad had an accident? Why did you create that dynamic?
It's important to me to show the life around my main characters. I love writing side characters. In fact, I have a real problem with side characters. Sometimes they just overtake the narrative. It's a problem. I feel like every single book I've written so far has this 10 people in the background who are look at me. And I'm calm down. The book's not about you. But they, as a writer, they just pop into my head. I don't know what it is subconsciously that I'm thinking about, where, a character as funny as, Hannah's cousin Rashid just jumps into my mind and is like taking over the page and making jokes and kind of stealing every scene that he's on. And then her parents, I just wanted Hannah to be part of a community that loved and accepted her. You know, that was really important. Sorry, you're a little frozen. Am I frozen? Don't think I am, but I might be.
No, you're not frozen.
Okay.
I think that's Bianca a little bit.
Okay, no problem. I'll just keep talking. I'm sure she can hear. It's probably just the video. So I wanted to show, you know, a person of color, a Muslim woman who was supported by her family, because I think a lot of times the stereotypes about definitely you know, Asian women, Muslims in particular, is one of confrontation between her and her family. And I wanted to kind of push back against that, because that personally has not been my experience. My family's always been very supportive of me and what I want to do. And so I knew that I wanted her to have, for instance, a really close relationship with her father. And her father happened to be disabled. Like, he was in a very terrible accident. He's dealing with chronic illness, chronic pain. And in some ways, the parent-child role is sort of reversed, because she's actually, in some ways, with the rest of her family, acting as his caretaker. One of my favorite characters in Hana Khan Carries On is a character who basically like parachutes into the story, and this is Kokab Khala. So this is the aunt who comes and visits Hana. She is probably the only character in the book who is based on a real person. Everyone else is just made up, but Kokab Khala is Hana's aunt, and this is her mother's much older cousin. So it's kind of like a aunt once removed, and she's not married, but she has a really interesting story, which is revealed over the course of the book. And her experiences as like this really strong, kind of badass Muslim woman who really pushed back against the expectations that her own family had for her in 1970s, 1960s India, really inspires Hana later on. And she makes a whole sort of like podcast episode about her aunt. And that particular story is inspired by my own family mythology. So I had a great aunt. I never met her. She died before I was born, who had a very similar story to what happened with Kokab.
I loved that story, and I also liked how it was teased. How she told the story, but like we didn't know what the story was, and it was like, what is this story? I also like how it like introduced us to the sad auntie angle, which I truly didn't see coming, but it all related back to what ends up being sort of the whole the overarching thing, which is like family secrets. And so what was the decision for having family secrets kind of being this like underlying weaving narrative and thread?
I think it's very common in immigrant communities to kind of have stories from back home that you don't talk about, whether it's because it's traumatic, whether it's because, you know, oh, it happened so long ago, I can't even think about it. And they're so consumed by what's happening right now in the present. But I think, I know in my family, and I come from a family that loves to chat, but there are certain stories that I'm like, I'd love to hear more about this, but it's almost too painful for them to talk about. And I thought, you know, this, I think, is something that everyone can relate to, whether you're the child of an immigrant family or not. Everybody knows or is part of a family that just doesn't talk about certain things. And I wanted to explore the impact that can have on a young woman who's trying to figure out who she is. And when she hears the story of Kokab Khala, for instance, someone that she'd kind of heard about but didn't know, you know, like Kokab Khala basically, you know, not to tease the viewership here, but basically she made some decisions when she was younger that were very outlandish and very surprising for her time period, where she had an arranged marriage and she really pushed back in a really really badass way and hearing the story from her aunt and hearing all of the details of the thinking and the consequences of how her aunt had to live with this decision even after it was done, I think really helped Hana come to some decisions of her own. So I still think it's a good idea for a podcast. I don't know if I'll ever do it, but just have a podcast where people just dish on their secret family history and how hearing the secrets of their family change the way that they thought about something in their own life. Maybe I'll do that one day, but I think it's interesting. I think every family has a story, you know, like my family, every time I talk to, you know, like the elders, they'll share something and I'll be like, that's a great story. That's really interesting. And to have their perspective on so many different things. But I think families just don't talk to each other sometimes. And that can cause a lot of problems. It can cause a lot of, I understand why some of them don't, because honestly, my family has probably been through a lot of really difficult experiences, and I'm sure that's the same for lots of immigrant families. But I think sharing those stories with the next generation is a way to keep them alive and to help us remember and maybe make good decisions.
Very true. And I like how you said that it's potentially hard for them to talk about, because we kind of live in the land of like ancestry and DNA and like 1, 2, 3 and me, and it's like you want all the stories, but sometimes it's like they can't talk about it. It's just too hard. But also something about your book, like you said at the top, is that food is like very central to this story, and something that a lot of immigrants, and I've noticed this in my family, is like food is something that, you know, is like really important. It's like how you show love. It's how you come together. All of your celebrations center around food. So why did you want that for this book? Why was that the central thing?
I love food. I mean, especially during COVID, like what else has there been to do except eat?
Yeah.
So this, I have to take you back to pre-COVID. I got to take you back all the way to May 2017. And I had finished writing my first book, Ayesha At Last, but I hadn't sold it. I hadn't even really, you know, started the process of trying to get it published. And I was out for dinner with my husband. We were celebrating I think it was my birthday or anniversary. No, it was my birthday. It was in the spring. And we decided to go to this halal steakhouse in Pickering. The name is Affy's. And, you know, we're eating steak, ribs or something like that. And I was looking around and I was telling my husband, you know, like we were both born in Canada, and I was saying, you know, a place like this never existed when we were growing up. Like we couldn't get halal steaks anywhere except our mother's kitchens, because like and those halal options just simply did not exist. They've definitely come up in the past, I would say 15 years. And how much food is sort of, it's like a metaphor for the way that communities change and develop and grow, the stamp that they put on their surroundings. And I just thought it was so interesting, the way that food can, you know, it represents a people, it represents a culture, but it also represents the way that they're changing the culture around them and they're contributing to that culture. Now my kids can get, you know, like they're eating burgers for dinner today, and they can get halal burgers like 5 minutes from our house. You can get halal pepperoni on your pizza anywhere you like. It's amazing and astonishing to me. And it's also so powerful. So I think it would be really funny to use food as sort of a shorthand to talk about community, but also the way that community changes. Like Hannah's parents run this kind of hole-in-the-wall Indian restaurant, and they're struggling because the community has changed. The community now doesn't want the Indian staples. They want like fries and burgers and milkshakes because their tastes have changed as they have grown and they're getting into the second and third generation, even within this immigrant community. And I thought that would be a really interesting thing to talk about in a subtle way through a book. And also, I just love You've Got Mail, so I use that as a starting off point. But yeah, I wrote this book because I went out for dinner with my husband in 2017. I actually finished writing this book in 2019, so it was pre-COVID.
The days of pre-COVID, what was that like? So back to the topic of family. So I loved Rashid. I loved him so much. He was like one of my favorite characters. And I found that he connected a lot of the dots. Like a lot of the really important things Rashid is a part of, especially like when I think back to the book, I'm like, yeah, Rashid was downtown. Rashid was at the BOA, like Rashid was around. And so how important was Rashid to you when you were conceptualizing the story?
He kind of came out of nowhere, actually. It was really funny. It was one of those experiences where, you know, I had the main idea. I was like, okay, she's, you know, this is who Hannah is. This is who the love interest is. This is her job. This is the restaurant. Okay, I think I'll give her like, you know, because I write these books with these huge cast of characters, I'm going to give her a cousin and an aunt. And then when I started writing the book, this kid shows up and just is like I said, like he just started like gnawing the scenery. Like he just had the funniest lines, and he was so funny to watch, and he was just such a joy and a delight. And that's the beauty of a side character, because the story is not about them. They get to like kind of act up in the background. But Rashid and Gokub are really inspired by my experience with as an immigrant, of having family visit from out of town. And so not just visit, but actually immigrate. So my parents were the first from our family to move to Canada, but they sponsored, aunts and uncles after them. So I have now quite a large family in Canada, in large part because my parents brought a lot of them over. We're kind of like, hey, we're here. Why don't you come? You can have family in Canada. So I had, I even had like an adult cousin, 2 adult cousins moved to Canada when they were in their early 20s. And so Rashid is sort of loosely inspired by my experience of having this extended family, adult cousins, adult aunts and uncles move, and watching that kind of culture shock, but also the way that they found their place in Canadian society, even though they had kind of left everything that they knew and loved behind. And I wanted him to be really funny and very self-possessed. And she thinks he's just like this guy from like the bend, like this guy from the countryside who doesn't understand anything. And even her friend Yusuf is like, oh, do you know what electricity is? And like makes these like really awful comments, right? Like, oh, you're from a third world country. But he's like, I'm from money. I know what's going on. I know how to handle myself. He's probably been in like more fights than Hannah has. And I just wanted to show like the worldliness of this young man. But he was also really fun and funny. So that's what I was inspired by, my extended family, really.
I also think that just shows you, like, when people think of like people coming from India or Africa, they like expect someone who's like living in the sticks, and quite often, they're from like metropolitan cities, just like ours,
Of course.
So I mean, the $1 million question, and this is so relevant right now because hello, Mindy Kaling, Amazon. So I mean, who would you like if you could have your dream cast of characters? Who would play Hannah? Who would play Aiden? And who would play Gokub?
Yeah.
Gokub. Who would play those 3 like very important characters?
Oh my God, I don't even know. So I get this question. I know I should have a dream cast, but I get this question a lot, and I never know how to respond. And I feel in a way this is just like a function of how few like racialized actors there are in Hollywood that I'm really familiar with. I can think of more men than I can of women, which is really sad. Like I can think of like the Riz Ahmeds and the Kumail Nanjianis and the Himesh Patels and those guys, but I can't think of who would play Hannah. So if you have any suggestions, let me know. But I don't know if the movie people will even ask me. They'll be like, "Oh, you're in Toronto, you don't know anything."
Well, and I think it's really like that touches on such an interesting conversation about representation and young Muslim girls finally being able to see themselves on the screen. And I think that it's really, telling and also encouraging that Amazon Studios bought not just 1, but 2 of these.
Yeah.
And so did that surprise you? Was that something you were always thinking, like, this should be a movie? Or was it you were just like, oh my God?
Oh no, my first novel was optioned by Pascal Pictures. So they're with producers who were with Universal, and then previously with Sony. And then my second book, as you said, has been optioned by Amazon Studios and Mindy Kaling, which is fantastic. I think the shock happened more with my first novel, Ayesha At Last. I actually have it right here. This is my reader copy, so it's a little bit beat up, but this is Ayesha At Last. So way back in 2018, when the book came out and it did really well, I was so surprised. I need to stop being so surprised by everything, but I still am so surprised by everything. And I remember in the summer of 2018, I have a film agent, and he said, "Oh, we have an offer from Amy Pascal, and she wants to option your book." And I was just like, what is my life? I don't even understand. This is the producer. This is the producer of the Spider-Man movies. You know, like this is like a major Hollywood player, and she wants to option my book set in Toronto, and not even in Toronto, but in like a very tiny Muslim community. Not tiny, but like in the grand scheme of things, a very niche Muslim community in Toronto. And it's the Pride and Prejudice retelling. I think this is amazing. So that really surprised me. And then when we got the news about Mindy Kaling with Hana Khan, this we announced in August, but I knew the previous fall. It was just like this is 2 for 2. This is crazy. I don't even. I mean, I spend my days in the introduction. I'm a high school teacher, so I spend my days marking and lesson planning and dealing with high school students, and then my evenings writing books. And I feel like writing books is just like throwing something out into the abyss, and you just don't know where it will end. That's like with so many of our dreams, right? We just hope and pray that something will happen, and maybe a lot of times nothing does. It just, you know, floats away and nothing happens. But for this, I knew I was happy, not just for myself, but I was happy for, like you said, the fact that these stories are gaining relevance and traction. Maybe they'll inspire some young girl or some young boy who is Muslim, who is South Asian, who's racialized in some way, be like, oh wow, here's this woman in Toronto who optioned 2 books, and this means something. And if they actually get turned into movies, that means that these things will exist on the screen, where there's authentic representations of Muslims in Toronto. Like, how amazing would that be?
Oh my gosh. Everyone needs to go see it the weekend it comes out. If it comes out on Amazon, you need to watch it the day it drops, because the more these things are successful, the more, you know, they option these stories. Because what I love about this, and I say this too as being like a Black woman, is that, you know, more stories of like love and like these meet cutes and these like social media, like all of these things that are about joy and pleasure from the perspective of Muslim women or Black women, as opposed to the old stories of like sadness, war, slavery, and such, you know?
Totally, yeah. And I feel the exact same way. Like, there's so many stories about brown people that are just about victimization and arranged marriages and abuse, and it's just unrelenting sadness. And I'm like, isn't there enough darkness in the world? Like, we're at end times here, you know? We need to find joy where we can, and then like cram our life full of that joy, because the world is already so dark. And as much as it's important, like my book definitely has dark moments in it. As much as it's important to acknowledge and to see the darkness, we also need the light. We need that joy.
And I think when we show the real lives of people, Muslim families, Black families, Asian families, then it demystifies, you know, for some white supremacists who are scared of the big, scary, you know, Muslim person, seeing real life and how you move through life very similar to them. You cry real tears, you mourn people, you celebrate, all of these different things. I think that brings more understanding at like a day-to-day, like human level.
That's it, exactly. It's not these big, grand performative gestures. That's why I write about just regular, everyday people. Like, Hannah isn't, I don't know, some like major CEO of a big company. She just wants to work, get a job. She's thinking of like her pension and her union, you know, joining a job that is steady. That's all her parents want for her, and that's so relatable. I think like this is everyday life, in a very typical immigrant family.
Yes. It was, I loved it. I loved this whole book. Like, it was a page turner. Because usually I find that like I have to like, you know, schedule time, like 2 hours to read the book. But I found myself just like immersed. I was like, oh my God, I'm already on chapter 36, or I'm already on chapter 42. So last question before we get into the Q&A is, you said you're a teacher by day, you know, author by night. What's next? What kind of stories are you like hoping to tell next?
Well, I'm working on my 3rd book. It's on my desk right now. It is due to my editor in about 3 weeks, so wish me luck. It's another rom-com. And this time I'm writing in romance terms, it's a second chance romance. So that means that the characters were involved with each other before, and now they're kind of meeting many years later and rekindling their relationship. And again, it's about Muslim characters, because I think it's important for that type of representation. And as one of the few Muslim writers in Canada who are publishing, I these are the stories that I'm interested in right now. And it's loosely based on another Jane Austen novel that I love, which is Persuasion. I'm really excited to finish it because I've been working on it, toiling away for the past year. I'm really excited to finish it, and it'll be out in 2023.
Amazing. This is so exciting.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to get to the Q&A. And like I said, this is a great conversation because I really feel like we talked about the book without giving too much away, should anyone not have read it. So the first question is, can you talk about being inspired by a movie and a book, and are they different?
Oh, yeah. Actually, it's funny. My first novel is inspired by it's a retelling of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and Pride and Prejudice is like that classic enemies to lovers type of story where you have like Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. The funny thing about that book is I didn't even realize that I was inspired by Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice until I was well into drafting it. I think I was on my 5th draft before I realized, because one of my writer friends pointed out, oh, you're writing Jane Austen, you're writing Pride and Prejudice. So I didn't know that that was my inspiration until I was almost done writing it, which is really funny. But the movie part of Hana Khan Carries On, the inspiration from You've Got Mail, is kind of incidental. What I was really inspired by is just again that metaphor of food representing a community, and the way that changing tastes in a community also mean that the food that they eat, the food they consume, and that's widely available also changes. So, and what that says about how deeply entrenched immigrant communities become. So that was kind of the main idea that I wanted to talk about, and of course turn it into a rom-com. But the thing is, you can't just be like, hey, publishers, I want to talk about the way that food is in a metaphor for for racism and for community and all of that. You need to like package it up in some way. And so part of my journey as a writer is trying to figure out the way into my story, to talk about the important things that I want to talk about, but be able to write it in a way that's relatable and interesting, and more importantly, instantly be able to grab potential readers. So as someone who loves rom-com movies, I was like, what's a rom-com movie that maybe would work in this, would kind of work as a vehicle for this conversation I want to have. So like Bianca, you read the book recently. Like if I hadn't said it's inspired by You've Got Mail, you might have been like, I don't see it, right? Because it's not an obvious inspiration, I don't think. It's threaded in, but you don't have to have watched the movie in order to understand what I'm trying to say in the book. So that's how I see my inspirations. Like, people are inspired by everything. I could be inspired by walking down the street and talking to someone and having a conversation. So whether it's a movie, it's a song, it's a book, it doesn't matter.
I saw You Got Mail years ago, like when it came out, so it wasn't fresh in my mind. It wasn't until after that I was like, it was like You Got Mail.
Yeah.
And then to add to that question, someone asked, what is it like to be inspired by a movie, adapted into a book that is turning back into a movie? And so, like, how do you toe that line of like it being fresh because it's been done so many times?
Yeah. Well, as the author of the book, I'm not involved in the making of the movie, in the sense that it's my IP. Like, I wrote the book, so they'll be using it as sort of a jumping off point, but I'm not the screenwriter. So they'll hire, they have already hired another screenwriter. She's a really talented Iranian American screenwriter who, she also wears a hijab. She lives in LA. So that's her problem, but I completely trust her, but I never thought of it in that way. It's funny that I was inspired by a movie, I wrote a book, and now it's being turned back into a movie. Everything is coming full circle. This is very meta.
Yeah, I mean, not to speak out of turn, but I feel like you're going to be rich.
If only the life of a Canadian writer.
I predict it. You'll be able to buy a semi-detached home in Toronto, maybe. And then the last question that I see here is, first, thank you for writing this book, echoing my sentiments. But also, do you have some other authors to suggest that write from your perspective as well?
Yeah,
like your type of.
There's so many exciting things happening in publishing. A friend of mine, her newest book just dropped, and her name is Zarqa Nawaz. She's actually the creator of the CBC hit sitcom from a few years ago, Little Mosque on the Prairie. So this is her novel debut. She wrote a memoir a few years ago, and the book is called Jamila Green Ruins Everything. And it is a really hilarious book about an unlikable main female Muslim protagonist who basically really is desperate to be a best-selling author. And so she does all of these crazy, zany things in order to achieve that goal, one of which is she starts an international incident in the Middle East. It's a satire about ISIS. It's a satire about terrorism. But it's really funny because it's written from the perspective of a Muslim woman who kind of lived through those post 9/11 years where there was rampant Islamophobia. And Zarqa is a really hilarious author. So she's one person. My friend Uzma Jalaluddin is an expat Canadian. She writes crime fiction. A fantastic book of hers is called The Language of Secrets. Those are the two books that I would recommend.
Amazing. Well, there's no more questions, but I mean, like I said, I feel like this book was such a refreshing read. I didn't expect it. There were a lot of things that were so unexpected, but looking back, I'm like, I liked it. And like I said, I feel like everyone needs a Rashid in their life. The guy just, he was like the kind of character that, and like the kind of personality that just, life works out, but he has a great attitude. I loved Rashid.
Yeah,
so,
me too.
I mean,
you're right. We all need a Rashid in our lives. We need someone who's just like, don't worry, it'll be fine. We'll figure it out.
Exactly. We all should embody Rashid energy. So thank you so much, Uzma. This was such a pleasure talking to you. It was a pleasure reading your book. And I can't wait for the big screen and the silver screen. Big things coming, and I can't wait for your next book.
Thank you, Bianca. This was so fun. It was so fun to dive back into this book and have this awesome conversation. And thanks to everyone who listened.
Oh, there's one more question, a late one. Okay. Are you going to do a sequel to any of your books?
They're standalones, all three of them, but they're all set in kind of the same neighborhood. And the book that I'm writing right now has a lot of cameos from past. So Rashid makes an appearance, and so does Hana and Aiden, and even characters from my first book, Ayesha and Khalid, make an appearance. I mean, let's see if they make it through the edits, but so far they're there. But an actual sequel, I've been thinking about it. I think I'd like to check in and see how Ayesha and Khalid are doing, and who knows, maybe I'll check in with Hana and Aiden. Right now, it's not in the works, but I wouldn't discount it. I'm still relatively new in my writing career.
I mean, yeah, and you put out some real bops. I love it. Like, you're coming out of the gate swinging. It's amazing. But I do like the idea of like cameos, because then again, it ties. It's like little nuggets in each book, and you're like, ooh, who am I gonna see?
Yeah, it's like a little Easter egg, right? Like people who've read the first two books will be like, oh, I know who that person is. I had a cameo of Ayesha and Khalid in Hana Khan, and it was very subtle. It was at the airport where Hannah's brother-in-law basically was like, oh, Khalid, and he went and talked to Khalid, but it was really subtle. And so people who'd read the first book were like, I know who that is. I love that. I love that, those kind of like winky inside jokes that authors do for their readers.
I love Easter eggs.
Me too. They're fun. Great.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's it for the questions. And also thank you for the Hamilton Public Library for putting this on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, great. Libraries. Love libraries. Thanks, Hamilton.
Yes.
Public.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.